Welcome to My on Mondays, an explorative approach to the possessive my through narratives, art, and sound. Each Monday brings a new creation and unique perspective. My on Mondays is brought to you by Angst Studios, a contemporary art space and international artist residency program dedicated to the exhibition, experience, and exploration of arts and culture. Along with exhibiting artists from around the world, Ming also serves the community by hosting innovative programs including performances, workshops, screenings, readings, artist talks, and other cultural activities. For more information, or if you'd like to participate in My on Mondays, you can visit our website at mingstudios.org. Hello and welcome to the 135th episode of My on Mondays. For today's episode, our three Angsty Poets, Tomas Baiza, Christian Winn, and Rebeca Evans, gathered again to talk about what's bugging them. What followed was a chat, a conversation, an argument, a connection. Here's the second episode in their series of angsty thoughts, My Angst with Autofiction, where they ask, what's the point? Tomas Baiza is originally from San Jose, California, and now finds himself in Boise, Idaho. He's the author of the novel Delivery, a Pocho's Accidental Guide to College, Love, and Pizza Delivery, published by Running Wild Press in 2023, and the mixed genre collection A Purpose to Our Savagery from Rise Press. Delivery was selected as the 2024 Treasure Valley Reads featured novel, and Tomas's writing has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize, the Best of the Net, and Best American Short Stories anthologies. Tomas has fenced in Italy, been rescued by helicopter from the Sierra Nevada, fended off wild dogs while hitchhiking in rural Morelos, Mexico, and once delivered a dozen pizzas to a Klingon-themed orgy at a sci-fi convention. When he's not writing, Tomas is running trails or obsessing over bonsai trees. Christian Winn is a fiction writer, poet, nonfiction writer, teacher of creative writing, and producer of literary and storytelling events based in Boise, Idaho. He's the author of two story collections, Naked Me and What's Wrong with You is What's Wrong with Me, and the forthcoming novels, Crocodile and My History with Careless People and Other Stories. His work has appeared in McSweeney's, Plowshares, the Chicago Tribune Printers Row Journal, Glimmer Train, Joyland, Expat Press, Tri-Quarterly, Gulf Coast, and many other fine magazines and journals. And from 2016 to 2019, he was the Idaho Writer in Residence, the state's highest literary honor. Rebeca Evans writes the difficult, the heartful, the guidebooks for survivors. Her work has appeared in Narratively, The Rumpus, Brevity, and more. She's earned 2 MFAs, one in creative nonfiction, the other in poetry from the University of Nevada, Reno at Lake Tahoe. She's authored a full-length poetry collection, Tangled by Blood, published by Moontide Press in 2023, and has a second poetry book, Safe Handling, forthcoming in 2024. She shares space in a tiny Idaho town with her sons and 4 Newfoundlands.
Okay, everybody, welcome to our second episode of Three Angsty Poets, which includes myself, Christian Winn, and Rebeca Evans, and Tomas Baiza. Today we're talking about our angst with autofiction in many varying forms, but I think we should start with, defining it. And Tomas, what do you think?
So autofiction is a combination of autobiography and fiction, both of which are not technically supposed to exist in the same universe, at least on the same written page. So this, in my opinion, is a very synthetic attempt to combine the two into a new form of literary genre.
Yeah, I think my take is different than that. I think autofiction is a cop-out.
I didn't use the word. Okay. I was trying to be technical.
Who's copping out here?
The writer. I think label your work. What is it? And I think if you want to include speculative or fiction and you're writing a nonfiction piece, then you signpost and signal the reader, like, this was in my dream, or I thought about it this way, or in my opinion or my perspective. You own the fictionalized or subjective view. If it's fiction, then, create it. But I think it's hard to get away from yourself as a writer in fiction. But I think calling it autofiction is kind of a cop-out. I think it's like you don't want to quite claim the story or the narrative as your own because you want to escalate it, maybe to make it more sellable.
Right, and I wonder, I don't know that the writer always chooses that term. It's a thing. I think it's a publishing term,
Yep.
It
That's
feels
true.
really synthetic.
Yeah.
It feels like something the industry would apply to somebody's writing.
I do know writers that have absorbed the term, and I think it's because they're afraid of putting their nonfiction story out there. There is a lot, if it's a shameful story or it's difficult to tell, it's easier to call it autofiction. So I want to give that.
I feel like that's a really charitable take on
I
why
do
people
too.
would use autofiction. I see autofiction as something that the industry and maybe some writers will resort to as a cop-out in order to titillate the reader.
Yeah.
It's fiction, but some of it's true. And can you decide which parts are true? We're
My
not gonna
alarm
tell
went
you.
off. That part was true, right?
It's annoyingly coy, and I really, I'm showing all my cards. I don't like
that's
the term.
okay. Yeah, it's a difficult term. I mean, I think that, it got its start, I think, as I understand it.
Yeah, give us the history.
In the late 70s, in a novel I've not read, by a guy's name I can't pronounce, so I'm not going to try to. But no, in the late 70s, it became like a term that was brand new. But I mean, there's going back to like in Cold Blood, sort of, in the Truman Capote, people were calling that a novel. I think people didn't know what to call sort of like almost like a historical memoir or sort of a reportage / memoir. They weren't sure what to call it. I think in this guy or this publisher came up with the notion of, let's call it autofiction, which is really a clumsy term. I think it's really kind of, it makes you think of auto asphyxiation and autoerotic asphyxiation.
Or just autobiography.
Or just like autobiography. It doesn't really make me think of autobiography. Or you could think automotive. I don't know. Is this it just sounds gross in the mouth.
Well, if you just use the prefix auto, then you could also just say self-fiction, which just feels just as gross to me.
It just is weird, yeah.
And I think, we moved into the term creative nonfiction to give the nonfiction writer some latitude with, we're not reporting, we're not journalists, there's not accuracy in your memory, right? This is the writer's lens of those events and one perspective, unless they've interviewed other people to get other perspectives, and there's fact checks that are done, which hopefully there is, but not always. And so the term creative nonfiction came into play. And to me, that
was a relatively new term as well.
That solved the problem. Well, in the last 10 years, right? I think.
Well, I think it has a little longer history than that. But there is a magazine called Creative Nonfiction. I think that is like, as I understand
they just came back online.
Oh,
they
good.
went offline for a little bit, but they just came back with narratively.
It's hard to make it in as a journal, but they're like, I think they were sort of the grandparents of like that, at least publishing that genre, and it was sort of a newer genre, but I just think it was a in-between type of genre where what do we do? Like, Moby Dick is Herman Melville's part of his real life as a whaler, came into that. He's not, sort of any of the characters per se, but like some of the whaling, this might be not the best example, but it's a long practice that, fiction writers have brought to the page of their own lives, deeply. And, they always, not they, but I don't know who they are, but they definitely tell you to write, what kind of thing. And that becomes something where it's difficult to sort of discern between what is your life and what is not.
See, that's the thing is, I don't have a problem with the fiction writer using their own story. I have a problem with the nonfiction writer making crap up. So there's a big difference. I think all artists, it doesn't matter what artist what medium you're in. If you're a visual artist, a musician, a dancer, performing artist, like you bring yourself to the table. So you're not going to get away from that. So fiction writers, yes, definitely do that. But I think nonfiction writers claiming something, well, we'll call it autofiction, so then I can embellish, right?
Okay.
And I think creative nonfiction, the terms solve that, like with This Boy's Life, with Liar Liar, or The Liars Club by Mary Carr. Like, I think those books that the genre grew into, like, hey, this is my lens, because didn't Tobias's wolf brother then write the other perspective of this boy's life, right? And so he's
this
like,
other boy's life, yes.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
my
like
brother's life, yeah.
Right. So they offered, like, yeah, that was his story through his lens, which was his truth. He didn't make anything up, but it was a different narrative than his brother.
Right. I think it, it's right. And I don't know if you guys find like a lot of nonfiction writers trying to, or wanting to use the term autofiction. Do you feel like that? No.
I haven't seen that.
That's what I've seen. Or
Okay.
I've seen fiction writers that figured out what they were really writing was a nonfiction story. And then they decided to call it autofiction.
Right.
So that they could embellish on the characters. So that's what I've seen it in the industry.
Right. And the term, I became personally like familiar with it through the writer Tim O'Brien, his book, which is really kind of not defined as any particular genre, short stories, essays, a novel, but there's a character. It's set in the Vietnam War.
Is this the things
before
they
and
carried?
after the things they carried? Yeah. So it is a wonderful book, by the way. I highly recommend it on all levels. But it's just he uses in the third person, he uses a character named Tim O'Brien. So I think that also the origin of that with this writer whose name I won't try to pronounce, who kind of came up with it. He I think has a third person character named after himself. And so I think that was the origin of it, but it's changed, I think, now, like in the contemporary publishing world. I feel like it's a term that gets thrown around, autofiction, in a way that's like way different than like using, like, it's Tomas Baiza as a character. If he's walking around the street and you're writing about a character named Tomas Baiza who's kind of you and kind of not you, I think that might be where it started as, but I think it's changed.
I think as the person I think in the room is newest to writing, I first came across the term autofiction in submitting manuscripts for publication, where a lot of publishers or some agents ask you to identify the genre of your submission, and it's a really I understand why it's necessary for them to weed through all of the things that they receive, but it felt kind of gross.
Yeah.
To see that autofiction term up there as a choice, and I looked into it and I thought, oh, I'm not liking this at all.
Yeah.
Because it suggests that you get to cheat. I'm submitting it as fiction, but I'm going to make my submission more compelling to you by suggesting that there are parts of it, maybe a lot of it, that's true.
Yeah.
And it's so edgy, I'm not going to tell you what parts are true.
Yeah.
And I've never, ever since I first saw that option, I never liked it. I've always rebelled against it. I've felt like it's unnecessary.
And from the flip side of that, I agree with you. And from the flip side of that, as a predominantly nonfiction writer, I feel like you take away from the truth of a story when you don't give it as complete nonfiction or as much nonfiction as you can, right? This is the truth as far as I can take it. I did all the fact checking I could. This is based on memory and journals and research, blah, blah, blah. But I think when you pull that plug and you don't want to call it nonfiction, you're pulling something from like our cultural pulse and our society of something that clearly happened at the time that changes how the story is received and the weight of the story.
Okay.
Right?
Well, why don't I read something?
Yeah,
and
you
then
go.
you can, well, I won't tell you, I want to tell you a little bit more about it afterwards, but consider this autofiction.
Okay, we're not going to comment on it though. We want to hear why you consider it autofiction.
Oh, well, once I tell you, then you can comment.
Oh,
Okay,
dear.
so is this called, it's a piece that has autobiography in it, has fictional elements, and it has my sister.
And it's in your book called
Naked Me,
Yep.
which is just says just stories. So this is a story, I know. So it's not necessarily fiction, but it
So
might
the
be.
most annoying question ever, Christian, is this fiction or is it true?
I know. Well, it's a little bit of both, but mostly true, this one, I would say. So anyway, and then we'll
Did
just
your
read
sister sign off on it?
it. No.
Okay. That's all we need to know. Go ahead.
No. Nope, I just wrote it, and I don't even know if she's ever read it, to tell you the truth. I hope so. But it's called Molly Ringwald. 25 years later, I'm watching Pretty in Pink on Christmas afternoon while my sister sleeps on the suede couch behind me, our parents gone off to church, her daughter in a side room, talking to her new American doll. It's raining hard all over SoCal, and the season seems remotely complete, with me here alone again, and now the television singing and whispering, disappearing the years as I sit up close eating red M&Ms, understanding scene by scene that I will never get over Molly Ringwald, or those OMD cassettes, or that fat spray paint graffiti head shouting at Ducky while he's down and waiting in his love for Molly, besides Stax, the Smiths record store. I mean, the way she bites her lip and sneers at James Spader in his white linen sport coat, the way she's smart and precious and a little too thick at the ankles. I love her too, Ducky. I fucking love her. We're all still in the middle of it. Those Psych Furs and New Order songs and Harry Dean Stanton waving surrender, surrender. I gave my life for you. It's what you wanted for breakfast, right? And somehow I got lost in all that Midwest urbania. Lost in the dim hopes of big hair and the tiptoe prom dance where the Pogues played the purest future on a 3-string mandolin, and nothing was easy, but dying was impossible. And I was with you, Molly, walking the looming echo of the high school midway and running hallways past the locker bays where Ducky drew blood for you, Molly, because he couldn't imagine his future self without you. And we, all of us, couldn't imagine anything but the joy of the bell ring and the next slow dance. Here, in Southern California, the knuckled palm trees sway across the sliding glass and ocean clouds billow above the canyons. My sister snores against embroidered silk pillows, and I remember how she wore imitation pearls and checkered Vans and her hair like Molly's that one year, lopsided and coiffed. And I wonder if she ever thinks how I hugged her one morning, told her she was cool, which meant that I loved her, wanted a perfect, kind life for her. I didn't know yet that this was impossible. I wanted it, though, even more than Andrew McCarthy does for Molly, who he takes to that shit party where everyone is shirtless and drinking scotch despite the fact they're in high school. And Molly's upset because she doesn't drink like a rich kid. Molly frowns that round red mouth. Molly tosses insults and takes a stand, and my sister rolls over, ignoring my niece's backroom whimper, waking only to point at the television and smile above the pile of used ribbons glinting in our dim afternoon. Years fold, and I don't recognize how one life became the other, or what happened to Molly's mother, and did Harry Dean ever get that job? What happened to the way we once loved all this bolo tie menace and our pony hair shoes? And fuck, John Hughes is dead. And he left his cities full of taffeta, left his house's back doors wide, where someone like me might stumble in to steal his creepers and dance like 1986, live forever on clove cigarettes and mopey anti-heroes and Molly. But that was only Christmas. It rained all week.
Yay.
There we go, Molly.
Like a Gen X anthem.
I know. It's, yeah. Sorry, I stumbled a couple times on a couple lines there.
Yeah.
But, yeah, so I mean, it's kind of like trifolding a little because those of you who don't know, Pretty in Pink is a movie. Molly Ringwald is an actor who was very big in the 80s and still around.
And Ducky was a character.
Ducky was a character. Harry Dean Stanton was the actor playing her father. Andrew McCarthy is an actor.
John Hughes.
But I can't remember the name of Andrew McCarthy's character, and James Spader also.
Do you ever need to remember the names of their characters?
No. So anyway, it's a famous John Hughes movie from 1986, and so there we go. And so it's kind of, anyway, because we're kind of, on a little bit of a time crunch here because we have just a small window in our angst here. So What are some things you guys thought about it being sort of, I'm calling this autofiction because it is autobiographical, and I could also call it a personal essay.
I guess I would ask, like, what part of it is actually fiction?
Well, I watched that movie in the room with my sister at Christmas time several years ago, and she had a daughter, and we were in Southern California, and the palm trees were swaying, and it was raining, and the movie's real. But I made up a lot of, I guess I just filled in a lot of the details about the red M&Ms.
Creative nonfiction is.
Okay.
Like, if you can't remember the color of the carpet, maybe you create the color of the carpet to create the emotional need for your reader, right? So the red M&Ms seem very significant. They're not green M&Ms, right? That have another connotation.
That's true.
So, right? So it's specific, but me listening to it, I don't assume that that specificity is completely accurate if it's creative nonfiction. Like, how could you remember, like, that type of detail? It's not reportage, right? So it's different.
Right.
So if creative nonfiction allows you to quote unquote lie, and is it a lie if you're really just trying to fill in gaps, then what's the opposite of that? If creative nonfiction is ultimately supposed to be something that bends towards the truth, then what is the opposite? What is a piece that uses both real events and non-real events but bends towards the fictional? Is that fictional veritas? What's the word for that?
I wouldn't say creative nonfiction allows you to lie. I think there's a complete difference. Like, I think a lie would be like, he doesn't have a sister, you know? Right. I mean, like, he never saw Pretty in Pink or whatever. Like, I think that would be a complete lie and fabrication.
And so does that make it, so then if it bends towards fiction, in that case, using those examples, is it no longer creative nonfiction? And if not, what is it? Is it autofiction?
I know. Well, I would call this, I don't really want to call it autofiction because I don't like that term, but I know, but I feel like for me too, it's an interesting thing to come across. Like in this book, it's it's like, gosh, I mean, 90% of the happenings and characters are fictional in this book, or more. There's some stuff we won't even have time to get into in this book that, you know, I wanted to just say, like, definitely I drew from real life, but I wouldn't want everybody to think, oh, this piece in here is nonfiction, like creative nonfiction, because then they might read some of the other less flattering characters in the first person, like a creepy uncle who's, you know, kind of not a good dude who appears in first person, you know, and I don't want that to be thought of as like, that was me. And I think like branding it as like it's interesting, like this is all in a book that's about, you know, sort of fictional characters primarily. This is, you know, this piece lying in there is kind of interesting.
But you called the book stories, like the genre is a short story collection, which is fiction. Yeah. So it's safer. Like, I think there's a difference between something is based on nonfiction and you call it fiction. That is a completely different thing, which I think a lot of writers do because we base our stories on our lives or things that we have absorbed in the world around us somehow. So I think that's safe, right? Right. But calling it, like, I've now seen books, hybrid books, where they're stories and essays, and you don't know which is which. What? That's wrong. Like, I feel like there's a contract.
I'm literally trying to sell a manuscript that fits that exact description.
Yeah. So you want to lie in that space in between.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm gonna go out on a limb here and point out a decision that you made, not a mistake, but a decision that you made in writing that piece that in some ways decides for the reader how they're going, for better and for worse, I would say for worse, that decides for the reader how they're going to understand what you just read. You chose first person. Right. There will be people, many, most, who read that and say, oh, this is the author speaking about himself and his life and everything in it is real. Yeah. Period.
Yeah.
There will be lots of
and that's true.
I don't want to say bad things about the reader, but that's like not a good way to read if you're, you know.
But that's how they empathize with you as the writer. That's the catch-22 of using first person and writing something that feels real. They can't help but say, they shared that with me.
And how many times in poetry do you have to remind the audience, like, this This is a speaker, not the poet.
Right.
Right? The
Right.
I, the
For
we,
sure.
right?
We didn't even get to poetry yet.
Right.
because it's
Which
like
I'm going to
straight-
read some poetry,
Yeah,
so
that's
I'll
perfectly- yeah,
resolve that.
Yeah. But
yeah.
it is like, it does.
So there's an assumption that's
Like,
made with the contract with the reader that you're closer to the narrator when you're writing in
Right.
first person, right?
Yep.
There's an assumption.
It becomes confessional,
Which
like
we
it or
can
not.
have another angsty,
I know.
episode just on
Just
that.
My
that.
angst over the first person.
Right, our angst
know.
over
I
how
love the
readers
first
read the
person.
first person. I love first person.
And also,
right?
it's just they like to look at your picture on the book or look you up online and be like, Rebecca,
You're that ugly uncle.
I know,
right?
I know. Or you're that
I'm gonna
guy,
reread that
kind of
uncle piece and
that
like
angsty,
not even be able to sit in the room with you now.
brother.
Okay, so I'm gonna read a poem, maybe two, I don't know, but we'll start with this one. It was just recently published in McQueenie's, and it's entitled "We Drank Our Coffee and Believed." We liked our coffee strong, though this was my first taste of brew, and it was made military way. I needed the jolt, the wake up. It was dark 30, and I suffered only half through my shift. We drank our coffee on the tarmac beneath the yellow-mooned Indiana sky, weeping with fireflies. We drank on break, and a senior airman added Kahlua to his steamy styrofoam, but he was the only one. No one dared drink from the stained porcelains. Who knew who came before, who left, who went? We drank our coffee black. We wanted the bitter bite. No one asked for sugar or cream. No one dared. No one asked. We asked for little. We asked for nothing. We drank our coffee unblinking and watching the MP unload a full load onto the nose of the A-10. And when the other security guards wrestled him down, ungripped his M16, he looked over his shoulder and said, "It smiled at me." We drank our coffee and believed the military night could take your mind, take your gun. We believed a smile could spread, startle you into shooting, startle you awake. We drank our coffee. We said we liked it strong.
There we go.
All right,
Wow.
so it's a poem in first person plural. What's the assumption?
If I'm reading the description of the author on the back of the book and see that you were in the military, I'm going to think lazily, that happened.
Yeah, and if it's in a collection of poetry, I don't know. I don't know that I'd go there per se, but I know, I would definitely think that it came from some kernel of truth. I don't know that I would
Right.
read this necessarily as the truth whole cloth, but all this happened, including the tackling of the guy with, sort of the automatic rifle, right?
Yeah, the M16, yeah.
The M16.
Yeah.
And so do you want to tell us how
Yeah.
real it was? And also your choice to go with the plural, sort of.
Yeah, because, well, first of all, the we plural, this is a completely true story. It's a true narrative. I choose poetry in writing what I think is sometimes the most difficult narrative to unpack, right? Because it allows me access into hard stories. And the we is the collective military. Like, this was not uncommon crud that was going on, And this guy went nuts on the tarmac. We're just sitting there like watching the sun come up. It's like, 4 or 5 a.m. in Indiana and drinking coffee, trying to stay awake. And this guy just totally unloads onto the nose of an A-10,
So he just fires his M16.
Just completely. Yeah, just completely. And security wrestles him down, and we're like, what happened? And they're like, he said it smiled at him. And the thing about the A-10, if you've ever seen like the front, the A-10 is a really cool plane. The wings are as wide as the plane is long. In the sky, it looks almost like a square, right? It's a bomber. But the front of it, the nose of it, has a smiling mouth on it, usually painted, the A-10 does. And those did there in Indiana at Grissom Air Force Base. So completely true story. And but the thing about poetry, if you're not a poet and you heard this, you would probably think nonfiction. If you are a poet and you hear this, you assume this is a speaker and, what is this a metaphor of, right? And you're trying to go deeper into imagery when I write poetry and memoir, right? I write narrative poetry. Most of my poetry is, I would call nonfiction, or at least most of what I've published has been creative nonfiction in whatever form I've chosen. So it's not autofiction.
I would hope that somebody who's reading a book of poetry would take the latter approach that you just mentioned, that it wouldn't matter to them whether this story was quote unquote true or not. What would matter to them is the imagery that it evoked and what it made them think about the character, in quotes, even though the character is you, the writer. And what does it say, and I'm going to use this annoying phrase, but what does it say about the human condition through the pinhole of this piece? And I would hope that the reader would use the poem as a catalyst for thinking about life,
Right.
as opposed to try to impose truth on it. But in my own experience, a lot of people try to impose truth on it because that's, I think, an easier ramp up to relating with the author than not knowing and being
Right.
okay with not knowing.
Well, and instead of using it, like you said, as the opportunity to look at government, to look at industry, to look at community, to look at influence, right? Which is what the poem can push, right? And what happens when you're in that isolated space of influence, right? What can happen to you? Then, you can use it for such a
Right.
broad sense of crossing boundaries and borders and cultures if you use it like true art, should be
Right.
used,
That's
right?
yeah. So if you are calling this a memoir in verse, let's say you're trying to, then you're making, you're bringing poetics to true life events, and I love that. I mean, that's a good title, and I shouldn't say it, a good classification, I guess, when it's a memoir in verse, or if it's just a memoir in stories. Where it's like the art comes through to true life experiences and you can morph them. But I think one of the thing that's really, we'll just say fucked up about, sort of autofiction as a term is I think it's really important as a reader to enter a collection generally. I mean, when I read Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, it has Tim O'Brien as a character. I'm not, I can understand it as just an unlabeled book of stories, fiction. I'm reading it as fiction. But if you're calling it autofiction, I think it does do the thing you're talking about, Tomas, as far as it brings the reader to think oh, this must have happened to Tomas for sure, this story. And that's I would rather just call it fiction if you're going to make it fully, just maybe if it's happened to you a little bit and it's
Just call it fiction.
and then,
just own it.
or if it's
one way or
creative
the other.
nonfiction,
Yeah.
then the reader will bring a different set of expectations. That is,
It's the
slippery.
contract with the
So
reader
it's the
that gets
autofiction just
lost.
muddies the water as a term.
The same
in-
with, no offense, Tomas, but the same with fusing, here's essays and stories, and I'm not going to tell you which is which. My experience with those is going to be completely different. And I think it does break a little bit of contract with the reader, right?
I would argue that it's not my responsibility to tell the reader how
Right.
to read it. Read it however the hell you want. I wrote it. It got published. It's out there. I own all of it. Read it.
Right.
And if you think it's true, awesome. If you don't think it's true, you think it's a total lie, awesome. My question is, despite that, did you like it? The most
Right.
important thing for me is that it has an impact.
you
But
like
I don't think it's my
But let me-
responsibility at the beginning of a story to say, this is a story, none of it's true. Or the next chapter, this is an essay, all of it's true.
Then what do the labels do for us? Why label anything fiction or nonfiction? And what does the autofiction label even do for us? Let's
Right.
talk about that
Good question.
before you read, Tomas, because I'm interested in that. Then why bother even having genre at all?
Because
what's the point?
bookstores need to have
Book
titles,
sales,
don't they?
You have sections in your bookstore.
Yeah.
I know, it's sort of...
And libraries.
And there's a whole different conversation we can have about just genre in general, sort of as a, difficult, slippery, sort of sales tactic / sort of... I
feel
mean,
like-
it's you can get pigeonholed into a genre if you're someone who writes,
I feel like I have a
go ahead.
different interaction, and it is about engagement. It's about interaction. I interact with a film differently when it says based on a true story.
Because those are just generally.
I
It's
don't
like-
believe
I
it.
know,
I don't
exactly.
believe it.
When you say based on a true story, it's hard, yeah, but I know.
Right? There's a different
true.
expectation.
Right.
And there's a different interaction.
That's
So
true.
I'm not expecting, people to fly or, some really crazy speculative
Right.
stuff unless I'm signaled that it's a dream or whatever.
know.
So I have a different interaction with that movie and a different level of inspiration
again-
and emotion that I walk away from if that person really overcame something. Like there's
Okay.
a different
Well, I just
experience.
saw, for instance, I just went and saw the film Back to Black, the Amy Winehouse
yeah.
biopic. And there's a million biopics out there, but because it's a famous person who's now dead at a young
I
age,
don't
and I
think
kind of
they
know,
did-
and it's like, when it's that, it's different than based on true story.
Right,
true,
because
you know,
she
sort of-
can't check it. Like I don't think that's
Oh.
fair. So I've read a lot
I
of
think it's fair personally, but I think it's like you coming
to
in with your
her.
expectations differently than you would be like, what's a good example of a based on movie?
well, the
that we should-
Elvis Rocket Man documentary where he was on the set and he had a say, and so yes, it's edited based on his lens, right?
on
Elvis's Elton John. Sorry,
Elton John.
Elton
Yeah, Elvis, I was like, Elvis was on the
Elvis was
set.
on the set.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, he's
Yeah, that's
still
cool.
alive,
Right. That's a whole different conversation, that one, and also like being on the set. So but anyway, we kind of veered out of the
I know, the
autofiction, but it
autofiction.
does based on
Well, to me, the based on a true story
there's other
is
movies
the
I'm not
same as autofiction. I equate the two.
It could be.
I
It could
equate
be.
the two.
based on.
Based on a true story, which parts are true?
Right.
Or all of it's true, but
then-
they dramatized it.
And then the reading of a first-person narrator, like you mentioned before,
Yeah.
kind of brings a whole. It just piles on that idea that it's true, and then it's first person. That must be how.
I don't
Tomas
disagree
experienced
with you, but I think the expectation changes.
I
The
agree.
reader expectation changes
I agree.
based on that one line, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not expecting to watch, the Avengers superhero, right? There's like a different experience that you're showing
Sure.
up for, right?
I know, and I guess it is a matter of like the marketers had to figure out like what kind of clickbait they can give you, like what's going to make you watch. It was like, oh, it's based on true,
I feel like the
happenings.
perfect example of how based on a true story completely perverted a real story was The Blind Side.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah,
and
yeah.
for the last 20 years, all we've had, it feels like, are shocking stories about how the movie wasn't true. And people coming out saying that never happened, or I was exploited and that wasn't depicted in the movie. And so
Or
there's been
even
more
writers who
press.
have come back and said like they left so much out of the book it changed how the film came out, right? So the writers in the writers' room, interpreted and are rewriting into script and screenplay.
Remind me what The
something
Blind
completely
Side is
different.
about.
It's about the football player.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who,
About-
he was homeless and taken in by a family.
That's
and
right.
Yeah. And then
Yeah.
he became a pro.
Sandra Bullock
player.
movie.
Yes,
Yeah.
old Sandy Bullock.
Inspiring movie, but yeah, apparently not true, and he won his court case, right? So it's
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
all right. Well, Tomas, you've got to read, and I'm dying to hear what you have to say. This has been so angsty and good. Like I love
know.
our opinions.
So this is thank you for indulging me. This is a slightly longer piece, but it contends with when we as fiction writers use quote unquote real events in our writing to create fiction. And so it starts off with a little bit of an intro, real life stuff, and it's called Thieves. Esto es para los pendejos que me han robado mis pinches libros. This is for the a-holes who have stolen my fucking books. Except, I'm wondering now if maybe you're not a-holes. A lo mejor no eres pendeja, you, young woman who approached me timidly after a reading. You held tightly to my book about a train wreck of a kid who straddled so many identity lines that every day feels like 10 years in a blender. We talked about imposter syndrome. We talked about difficult siblings. We talked about trauma. You made me not feel exotic. And when you walked away, my book tucked under your arm, I thought that maybe I could think of myself as a writer. And when I checked my Venmo later that night, it said $0.0. And maybe you're not a pendejo, you middle-aged dad who took some time to hang out with me at a bookstore signing. For some of us, signings are a special form of existential torture. So your friendliness, your openness felt like gifts. We talked about our children, our hopes for them, our fears for them, and I thought, this is not normal for middle-aged men. And when you left the bookstore, I hope that you felt heard. I know I did. And when I checked my Venmo later that night, it seemed that you'd heard nothing. A lo mejor you're not an a-hole, you, 20-something hipster rocking the vintage chocolate brown suede jacket and cooler than thou slouch, and enough curly hair to share with me except that I'd look like a total payaso as a blonde. From the stage, reading into a Shure SM58 microphone, I glanced over the heads of a dwindling audience at the Idaho State Museum. You loiter in front of a folding table on which my books rest, innocent and eager. You, tow-haired hipster shithead cabron, heft my novel, 630 pages of confessional semi-fiction that owes a heavy debt to all of the people whose stories I've appropriated. I'm halfway through my poem about Mexican mothers, when you slip that fat, indie-published, was never going to be a hardbound book into that perfectly tattered chocolate brown suede jacket and make for the door. After the reading, I walk slowly to the display table and check my Venmo. Nada, niente, nullus, nothing. And I wait for that first sizzle of insult and nada, niente, nullus, nothing. The righteous indignation of an artist wronged by the crass and ungrateful masses simply does not come. For I, your overprecious, overthinking, overwrought narrator, am a total hypocrite. A slow, syrupy, unstoppable chill of shame spreads across my skin like the first time I wet myself because, let's face it, there is no more shameless a thief in this world than a writer. How many moments of anguish, joy, horror, and pleasure have I stolen for the privilege of calling myself an artist? Who have I robbed? You, fiancé, whose heart I broke because despite your kindness and your beauty and the music of your laugh, I couldn't bear the thought of spending the rest of my life with someone who could only love the white half of me. I stole that pain, yours and mine, and used it. And you, professor, who told me I had no intellectual aptitude for graduate studies because of my accent and earrings and tattoos, back before every abuelita and her dog had ink. I refrained from attacking you in your office, but I vowed revenge, and so I stole that moment between you and me, and used it. And you, the other tall, light-skinned Chicano kid in my class, who jumped me behind the middle school gymnasium to prove to all the little cholitos who circled us that you were Mexican enough to be one of them. You ended up in the hospital with shattered ribs and a face so broken that they had to rebuild it with wires. You who never came back to 8th grade and never finished high school, and whose tia told me 10 years later that you were in San Quentin or Pelican Bay or Atascadero or some other man-made California hell. And sometimes I wonder if our fight was the beginning of the end for both of us. Yeah, I stole that fear, and the guilt that has chased it ever since, and I've used it. And you, the 5 cops who held me down at gunpoint, stood on my neck and pulled my shirt up to look for weapons or drugs or gang affiliations as I hallucinated from oxygen starvation. One of you convinced the others to remove the cuffs and stayed with me until I stopped shaking. I stole that shit, and I used it. And you, old friend, who at one party was a boy and gay, and then at the next party was, suddenly and emphatically, neither of those things anymore. You who fought with a ferocity I both feared and admired, to know who you were and why you were, and what that might mean in this screwed-up, twisted world in which all of us 15-year-olds found ourselves. At the foot of a stranger's bed, we found a stranger's record collection. You asked, "What do you want to hear?" And I said, "Surprise me." And in the half-light, you looked up with those eyes blacker than the vinyl, and I wondered if your being such a new person, and like me, half, gave you actual superpowers of awareness. But then I lost the thread because of your stunning high femme mascara that stretched into wings that were decades ahead of their time. And you dropped the needle, and I couldn't have imagined a better song to express how I felt for you just then. And I hoped and prayed that you had chosen that song on purpose. I stole that moment, and the song, and the feelings, and wrote 7 scenes that I will never change. Not even after a publisher said, "We love this book, but we need you to take these parts out." And I said, basically, fuck off, and moved on unpublished. And finally you, horrible, gross, dirty, shameless man. You who abandoned your diarrhea-splattered Under Armour chonies on a fence post up at Military Reserve, and, because I'm anal retentive, and because I hate litter, I ran 5 miles to the trailhead with that scatological hate crime dangling from the end of a stick, uttering every curse word I knew in English and Spanish and Spanglish. Who in the actual hell does that? Yeah, I stole that shit, and I'm still not sure what I'm going to do with it. We writers are thieves who crouch in the shadows, far from the glow of other humans' campfires, laptop vampires feeding on the warmth of others. And so, how can I be angry when you steal my book, earnest young woman, friendly middle-aged dad, couture hipster shithead cabron, when the people and moments that we writers so conveniently refer to as our muses are all too often our victims?
Woo. I love it.
Is that angsty enough?
Yes, so good.
I'd say that definitely. It's right up there at about a 9.5 out of 10.
And I don't even want to
maybe.
guess which parts are true or false, but I think, or, fiction or nonfiction, but I think it doesn't matter. Like, it comes back to, like, you don't need the label, but if you're going to label it, pick one or the other. Right? Just pick one or the other.
Yeah.
Like, walking the line, I think, is a crime. Like, I feel like we should be writing
Line is a crime. Okay.
citations to writers and publishers that just sit on the fence.
So
man.
then, having just said that, which I totally agree with, how would you take the question, which I have gotten, I swear, at minimum of 20 times, which parts are true?
I would say, well, with that piece, I would say because you have included fiction parts, I would leave it open, like, because it's just art, right?
I would say all of it, personally. Just because, I'm as primarily a fiction writer. We're bringing truth to the page.
I love that answer.
Yeah.
All of it. I think Mary Carr says, like, something 88% needs to be, fact for it to be considered like memoir, like fact, provable fact, documentable fact, right? I'm not
But
sure.
no one's going to come arrest you. So.
You could.
Well, I
get
guess depends on what you
ostracized.
write
Yeah,
about. But
yeah,
no one's just. If it's about your experiences, it's up to you, I guess. But it's also the publisher has to sell it. There's lots of examples we could bring. I just Curtis Sittenfeld, the fiction writer, has a book about Laura Bush as a fictional character, and about Hillary Clinton as
Well,
a
then there's
fictional
the
character.
historical nonfiction.
But this is also like full-on
fiction,
fiction, just like
right.
what if she never, like it's called Rodham, her novel about Hillary Rodham Clinton. And it's like, what if she never married Bill, like partway through the book.
Well, what about
and then-
Blonde, that was just out about Marilyn Monroe,
Absolutely.
right? And that's a
It's-
lot of
yeah.
assumption, right?
I know. So what's true? that's a whole different thing. But
But that, because Marilyn didn't
what do they
write it,
call it?
it's not autofiction, right? So it's like when the writer is calling it
No, it's auto.
auto.
What would it be? It would be biofiction,
Right.
or biography fiction.
Oh
Yes.
yeah,
There you go.
bio, which is even worse.
That
like
is
now
much
you
worse. It
just
sounds like it
started
just
another genre,
degrades,
Christian.
and there's like eco fiction. There's
Obviously,
there's,
we could sit like
Wi-Fi.
over a 10-course meal and angst about this and many other things, but we're going to wrap this one
We
with
are
this
gonna-
question. Like, why is autofiction, why is that term even in our world today? And how does it help? Like, we can, and maybe some listeners out there can like give us some feedback. Like, does the autofiction do us any good as readers, as artists, as teachers, as students? Like, what is it doing in the world? What good is it doing? How does it help,
Right.
define literary art?
I think we get back where we started. It is a publishing term, and I think that from going back to Tomas's anecdote about clicking a box about what genre their submission is coming through in, and it's clicking autofiction. I don't know if you clicked autofiction, but you just saw it on there. But I mean, it would be like the editors would read it differently. So it's. But I don't know what good it's doing us out there in the world. It's just a weird, muddled term.
In literary art, I don't know how it's contributing to literary art. So
I think readers and publishers would answer that question differently.
Right.
I do. I'm interested in that answer, but I'm going to still call it a cop-out.
Okay.
And that's a wrap.
That's a wrap. Well, let's just wrap it at that. It's like
Rebecca says it's a cop-out, and so we're done.
We're wrapping it.
Yeah. No.
You've heard our angst with autofiction. We have a lot of angst about this and a lot of really good conversation about it. I mean, I'm learning a lot, and I think, we may all three be writing autofiction next year and publishing it. Who knows, right? But we are the three angsty poets, myself, Rebeca Evans, and I'm with Tomas Baiza and Christian Winn. And we have a lot more that we're angsty about, so you're going to hear more and more and more.
And more. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Tomas.
Thank you for joining us today. We'll be back next Monday. Tune in.